Johnny and the Drinkles by Andy Rutrough. Johnny squirmed on his metal folding chair at church. His legs slid against the cold steel. His tie pressed against his throat. He squirmed again. "Shh! Sit still," Mommy hissed. He glanced up at her. Red lipstick, bright rouge, and a light blue hat marked her for church on Sunday morning. Pastor Schmidt, up in the pulpit, his eyes large behind black plastic-rimmed glasses, was saying something about Christmas. "Many new things are happening these days. For us this year, we will celebrate Christmas for the first time in our new building. On a world scale, the first heart transplant took place earlier this month, and Mariner 5 made its flyby of Venus in October. We human beings have made great achievements here in 1967, but even greater than any of those modern advances is the birth of Christ centuries ago." Johnny scooched up in his chair so that his feet dangled down. He liked the feel of his legs swinging back and forth in midair. "Johnny, stop," Mommy whispered. Sue, his sister, glanced over from the other side of Mommy. Daddy, on the other side of Sue, leaned forward with a frown. Johnny stopped, peered around. Miss Julie, his Sunday school teacher, sat in front of him, next to her father, Mr. Steinem. The children were allowed to call her Miss Julie because she was younger. "Less than 25, Mommy had said, "and not married yet." Miss Julie's long, dark hair curved down around her smooth shoulders. Her fingers moved like fireflies at night in summer. Johnny liked Miss Julie. Mr. Mansford sat 3 seats down from Miss Julie and Mr. Steinem. His purple heart from World War II peeked out from his jacket pocket and his sad frown from his face. Up above, light from colored glass windows shone across the church. Up there, near the altar, the choir sang and the pastor spoke, but down below in front of Johnny, in the strange space between Miss Julie's chair seat and the floor, there were shoes and dust and bits of dirt and a folded piece of paper someone had dropped. He stared at the paper, white amidst the steel chair legs. Who had dropped it? Did it have writing? What did it say? He would not reach for it. Daddy would spank him for that, but he stared at it. "God sends both the ancient and the new," Pastor Schmidt was saying. "Be ready for both." Johnny kept his eyes on the paper. He felt like something else was watching it, maybe even reaching for it, like he would reach for a piece of candy or a cookie. Then Johnny squeaked with surprise. A thin, gray-green hand with spindly fingers and an extra-long thumb reached out from beneath the seat of Miss Julie's chair, grabbed something from the paper, and pulled it back. "Hope, desire," a voice said in the back of his mind. Johnny glanced up at Mommy. She was leaning forward, listening to Pastor Schmidt. Sue was staring 3 seats over at Mr. Mansford's shoes. Daddy was studying a light fixture up above in which a bulb had burned out. No one had heard the voice. Johnny looked down at the paper and squeaked again with surprise. "Johnny, quiet down at once," Mommy hissed. "But, shh!" Johnny's eyes bulged. A tiny face was peeking back at him from beneath Miss Julie's chair. It smiled, and its wide eyes twinkled. Then it waved and disappeared under the seat. Johnny said nothing. As soon as church was over, Johnny hopped down and peered under the row before them. "Johnny, stop. What are you doing?" "Mommy, there's a little person under there." "What do you mean, a little person?" "With little hands. I think it's friendly." Mommy smiled at Mr. Mansford. "Active imagination," she said. Johnny looked back at their chairs as they walked out of church. Mr. Mark, who cleaned up after worship and who was young like Miss Julie, picked up the piece of paper and put it in his pocket, not like it was trash, but like it was a jewel or a piece of gold. Why did he do that? The next week, Johnny was ready for church before anyone else. He called to Sue, who was fiddling with a little star ornament made of glass that she had bought with her allowance. "Come on, Sue, hurry up." She put down her star. "You're the one that's always late." "No, I'm not." "Yes, you are." But they made it in time for Sunday school. Miss Julie showed them a manger scene. Johnny and Sue, along with Francis and William, the 2 other kids in the class, watched her point out the baby Jesus, Mary and Joseph, the shepherds and the angels. Johnny liked the shepherds best. Julie? Mr. Mark was standing in the door. Miss Julie jumped. Her neck and cheeks went pink. Yes? Julie, I hate... Mr. Mark stopped. Johnny swallowed a giggle. Everyone knew that Mr. Mark stuttered, and sometimes people laughed at him. But Johnny didn't laugh at him, because Daddy had spanked him for it a couple of months before. Mr. Mark is a good man, he had said. He works hard for the church, and he's a promising accountant. He just has a hard time talking, so don't you laugh at him ever again. Johnny kept his face very serious. Julie, I hate to interrupt, but they're putting up the tree, and I thought the children he took a breath. Might like to see. Oh, my goodness, I completely forgot, Miss Julie said. Of course, Mrs. Jones is going to show us the decorations. Thank you, Mark. She panted a breath. You're very kind to tell us. Mr. Mark nodded. Miss Julie led the class of 4 kids out of the Sunday school room into the church, where Mrs. Jones was hanging ornaments on a tree beside the altar. There were balls and crosses and stars. Mrs. Jones turned to the children. Oh, there you are. I thought you might not come today. I am so glad to see you. She picked up one of the decorations, shaped like a cross. Each of our ornaments has a meaning. What do you think this one means? It means Jesus, Frances said. Frances was the youngest kid in the church. Sue was the second youngest. That's right, Mrs. Jones said. She picked up a star. What about this one? The Star of Bethlehem, Sue said. Johnny squirmed. Mr. Mark was standing next to Miss Julie. The air seemed very full, almost crackly between them. He remembered a couple of weeks ago Frances had asked Miss Julie, Miss Julie, are you dating Mr. Mark? The whole class had giggled. Miss Julie had sat up, flustered, and then had settled. She met Frances's eyes. No, I am not dating Mr. Mark. Do you like him? Miss Julie paused. Yes, I do. Why do you like him? He talks funny. I like him because he's kind. Church started soon after Sunday school. Johnny watched with a sharp eye as they edged into their seats. As usual, Miss Julie sat down on the seat in front of them. Johnny noticed her hand slip beneath her folding chair and draw out a piece of paper. Glancing around, she unfolded the paper and started reading. Johnny saw that her face and neck had turned pink. She was breathing hard. Quickly, she drew a very short pencil out of her purse and scribbled something on the paper, then slipped it under the chair again, just before her father came to sit beside her. Who was she writing to? What did the note say? Johnny remembered the note under the chair last week, how Mr. Mark had picked it up as if it was a treasure. Were Mr. Mark and Miss Julie passing notes? Maybe they had a secret clubhouse, or a surprise for their mom or dad. Johnny remembered one time Daddy had written a secret note to him about a birthday present for Mommy. That had been fun. Carry in the book and call out surprise, it had said. When he had done it, Mommy had clapped her hands and laughed. Oh, Agatha Christie's Endless Night. I've been wanting to read this. Back in church, Johnny watched Miss Julie glance around and shift in her seat. Beneath her, a gray-green hand reached out and grabbed something from the air. Afraid, excited, desire, a voice said. In front of the church, Pastor Schmidt had started speaking. Johnny felt Mommy lean forward in her chair. Grace and peace to you, Pastor Schmidt began. Looking down, Johnny saw the little face again. It waved, then it swung across the space between Miss Julie's chair and Mommy's. Johnny's limbs seized up in amazement. The creature was swinging upside down. Its legs swept through the air in an arch, as if it would fall upward, not down, if it let go. Then, right between himself and Mommy, he saw the creature's dull green hand slip out from behind the chair and hold itself against the side of Mommy's head. Mommy smiled. Insight, mystery, the voice whispered. Now Johnny began to see the little creatures everywhere. In the middle of a hymn, a set of spindly fingers reached from the chair in front of Mrs. Jones and beckoned. Mrs. Jones closed her eyes and sang with her whole heart. When Pastor Schmidt prayed for the soldiers in Vietnam, 2 hands cupped themselves beneath Mr. Mansfort's face as if cherishing a stream of unseen tears. He glanced down the row toward Sue. She was sitting with her hands folded next to Daddy, staring down at several small faces peering up at her. Johnny reached his hand very carefully beneath his chair. He felt a tickling in his palm. He looked down, squinted. One of the little green fellows was nibbling something from his hand, but he couldn't see what. The word amazement whispered in his mind, and his palm tickled again. Johnny withdrew his hand. A little gray-green head looked up to him with expectations, just like their dog, Petey, looked up at Daddy when he wanted a treat. Johnny stared, wide-eyed, at the creature. He reached down his hand. Amazement, the creature said, and nibbled again. Then it dawned on Johnny. The creature was nibbling on his amazement. A movement just ahead of him captured Johnny's eyes. Miss Julie's father, Mr. Steinem, was standing up. Pastor Schmidt was saying, "Joe has an important announcement for us." Mr. Steinem stepped in front of the congregation. Daddy watched him with a spark in his eyes, and the tiny flicker of a hand appeared beneath him. "Energy," the voice said. Mr. Steinem smiled at everyone. "Next week our pews will be delivered. So this coming Tuesday night, a few of us are going to take all the folding chairs downstairs by the kitchen to make room for them. That way we should have a church full of nice maple pews in time for Christmas." Everyone clapped, but Johnny did not see any gray-green hands reaching out from beneath the chairs. Instead, a weight dragged on his shoulders and a frown on the edges of his face. One of the faces popped out from beneath the chair in front. It did not smile any more. It looked afraid. "Help us, please," the voice said. Johnny looked around. People were still clapping. What did the little friends want? Why were they afraid? The offering plate was passed around. He looked at his feet. There was the face again, peering up at him from beneath the row in front. "Please help us." At last it was time to go. Mommy smiled and scooched toward the aisle. She dropped her hymnal. Johnny said, "I'll get it," and climbed down to the floor. He grabbed the hymnal and glanced up at the underside of the chairs. He almost yelled in surprise. There were many of the little friends crowded under the chairs. "Come on, Johnny," Mommy called. Johnny followed after her, his arms tight. He had seen those little friends' faces. They were very scared. "Sue," Johnny whispered in the back of the car on the way home. "Sue, you saw them." "Saw what?" "The little friends." "What little friends?" "Under the chairs." "Oh, the fairies." "No, not fairies. They're gray and greenish. Fairies aren't gray and greenish." "Yes, they are. Just look at them. That's their color." Johnny stared at his sister. "But they're not fairies." "Yes, they are. They're a special kind of fairy." "No, they're not." "Yes, they are. They're a special kind of fairy called a Drinkle," Sue yelled. "Children!" Daddy growled from behind the steering wheel. Johnny and Sue straightened up till they got home. As they walked from the car into the house, Johnny leaned over and whispered, "They're really scared. I saw." Sue nodded. "The Drinkles are afraid." Johnny lay awake that night. What were the little friends afraid of? "They're not fairies," he thought. But then Sue's word sounded in his mind. It fit somehow. Fairies or not, they were definitely Drinkles. "Drinkles," he murmured. What would happen to the Drinkles? That Tuesday afternoon, Daddy sat him down on the couch. "Johnny, today you are going to come with me to church to help move the chairs into the basement so they can bring the pews in and set them up tomorrow. All good men help out at church, so you might as well get started now." Johnny quivered as he climbed into the front seat of the car. He and Daddy were going to help out at church. They met several other men with their sons gathered in the parking lot. Johnny was the youngest. "We'll move the chairs to the basement next to the kitchen and use them for dinners there," said Mr. Steinem. "Please help us," the voice whispered to Johnny as they entered the church. He looked around. No one else heard. Already Mr. Mansfort and Mr. Steinem were folding up chairs, beginning with the front row. Daddy showed Johnny how to fold a chair. Now you do it." Johnny did it, but not before he saw a flicker of gray-green leap from his chair to the next chair down the row. Johnny carried his chair down the stairs along with the other men and their sons. Bump, bump, it knocked against each stair as he stepped down. He leaned it against a long row near the kitchen, not far from where the pots and pans hung by long handles from hooks in the wall. Daddy said, "Good job. Now go and get another one." Coming back up the stairs, Johnny noticed Mr. Mark pulling a light bulb from a small cardboard box. A stepladder stood beside him, underneath the light with the burned-out bulb. Mr. Steinem held the ladder as Mr. Mark climbed up to the light, unscrewed the bulb, and replaced it with the new one. Mr. Mark came down the ladder and hesitated, like he wanted to say something to Mr. Steinem. At last he opened his mouth. "Mr. Steinem, Mr. Steinem stood there. Mr. Steinem, I was what? He stopped. "Say what you want, son. Take your time," Mr. Steinem said. Mr. Mark took a deep breath. Johnny could tell that everyone in the church was listening. No one looked, though. Everyone pretended to be busy with the chairs. Mr. Mark began to turn red, as if he was trying to push something out of his throat. "Mr. Steinem!" Mr. Steinem shifted his feet. He looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to move away. Mr. Mark became even redder, like he really wanted to say something but couldn't. Then, in a flash, Johnny saw one of the Drinkles leap from the bottom of the nearest chair to the underside of the stepladder. It was a crazy leap over a long space, and the Drinkle almost did not make it. It missed the first rung of the stepladder, but caught itself on the third, hanging upside down in midair by one hand. In a breath, it clambered up just high enough to touch Mr. Mark's shoulder and give him a sharp poke with 3 fingers just below the back of his neck. Mr. Mark stumbled forward and blurted in a voice that filled the whole church, Mr. Steinem, I was wondering if I could see your daughter." Mr. Steinem's eyebrows shot up. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it. All the men were watching now. "Well, you're a good boy. I'll have to think about it," he said. At once, the Drinkle drew in something from both men. "Surprise!" Its voice sounded in Johnny's mind, and maybe? Mr. Mark walked off to the back of the church, the burned-out bulb in his hand. "Johnny, don't stand and stare," Daddy said. Johnny grabbed the next chair and folded it. Again, a Drinkle fled from beneath it, but now Johnny realized something. The Drinkles make good things happen. They help people. But now they needed help. The men were half done moving all the chairs to the basement. Johnny felt another word in his mind, afraid. Johnny bumped his chair downstairs, set it in its row, came back up. Mr. Steinem was folding up 4 chairs and carrying them out at once. Like water, the Drinkles beneath flowed to the chairs down the row, but they had to move again because Daddy picked up 4 more. Johnny's eyes raced from one corner of the room to another. Where would they go? In just a few minutes, all the chairs would be gone. Would they fall up to the ceiling of the church? Would they break their arms like Frank Jason had broken his arm at school, falling off a swing set? Would they just disappear? Suddenly, Johnny felt like it would be a very bad thing if the Drinkles disappeared. No one would cherish Mommy's deep thoughts. No one would hold Mr. Mansfort's invisible tears. Johnny's heart pounded. Turning toward the chairs again, he saw the empty light bulb box that Mr. Mark and Mr. Steinem had forgotten on the floor. He picked it up. It was too small. Only a few of the Drinkles could fit in there, but it was better than nothing. Glancing around, Johnny saw that Daddy had taken his chairs down to the basement. Johnny grabbed the box, ran to the back of the church, and put it right side up and open beside the last row of chairs. The Drinkles peered out at him, clinging to the bottoms of the chairs. "Come on, get in," Johnny said, but they didn't. What was wrong? "Johnny, keep taking chairs," Daddy called from the top of the stairs. Johnny picked up a chair with both hands and carried it down. Bump, bump. Why weren't any of the Drinkles climbing into the box? Johnny racked his brain as he leaned his chair against the others. Then he turned around and saw a pot hanging upside down from the kitchen wall. He stared at it for a long moment. It looked like a big upside-down head with a thin neck, or maybe a very thin body pointing upward. "Oh," he said, and raced upstairs. The Drinkles couldn't be right side up. They had to be upside down, underneath a chair or a ladder or something. Otherwise, they'd fall upward. As soon as he got upstairs, Johnny ran to the last row where his box sat empty on the floor. 4 men were picking up chairs at the other end. The Drinkles were crowded in a tight bunch, very many under the last chair. Johnny flipped the box over and held it upside down just next to the seat. Very fast, very, very fast, the Drinkles poured under the rim of the box. Johnny opened his eyes wide in amazement. They were all fitting in. They were not even crowded. They could change their size to make room for each other. One little hand reached out of the box and drew something from the air. Amazement, it said. Johnny glanced up. The men had got halfway down the last row. Mr. Steinem picked up 4 more. Mr. Mansford 4 more after that. "I'll leave the last one for you," he said. Setting the box down, Johnny grabbed the one last chair and carried it downstairs with the other men and boys. Bump, bump, bump. The chair hit the stairs as he went down. He leaned it against the other chairs and raced back up. He gasped. Mr. Steinem had picked up the box and was walking toward the trash can. "Mr. Steinem, may I please have that box?" The words fell out of Johnny's mouth with a pant. Mr. Steinem shrugged. "I suppose, if it's all right with your dad." He looked at Daddy. "Frank, it's okay if Johnny gets his box?" Daddy looked at Johnny. Johnny knew that look. It was the "I'm not going to spoil you" look. Johnny swallowed and said, "Please, Daddy?" Daddy looked at him sideways. "What do you need this box for, Johnny? It's trash." Johnny straightened up. He had no idea what to say, but he met Daddy's eyes. "I would like to use it for Christmas, please." Daddy looked at him. Johnny could feel the weight of Daddy's eyes on his shoulders and his head. Daddy thought for what seemed like forever. Johnny could feel the other men and boys watching. Finally, Daddy said, "Very well. I will look for it at Christmas." He patted Johnny on the shoulder. "Thank you, Daddy," Johnny whispered. Carefully holding his box upside down, he followed Daddy out to the car, trying to think how he could use the box with Drinkles in it for Christmas. "What's in there?" Sue asked back home, peeking under the box's closed flaps. "It's the Drinkles. Don't look. You're not allowed to look." "Who says I can't look?" She gripped the box to turn it over. "Don't do that. You'll make them fall." "What?" "They fall upward. They'll fall out if you turn it right side up and open it." Sue bent over upside down and opened a flap part way. A little face peeked out. "Oh, you've brought the fairies. They're so cute." "They're not fairies, they're Drinkles," Johnny grumbled. The gray-green face reached out a thin hand and grabbed something out of the air. Johnny frowned. Sue grinned. "It ate up my cute." "What?" "I thought it was cute, and it ate it up." Johnny stepped close to the box. "It eats up Mommy's big thoughts," Sue said. Johnny looked at her. "Every Sunday, Mommy's big thoughts pour down, big and deep and wide, and the Drinkles eat them." "Oh. What else do you know about the Drinkles?" Johnny asked. "Well, they're shy, and they like us." Johnny glanced at the box, thought for a moment. "Where are they going to go? There's no chairs for them anymore." "What about the pews? Can they live under the pews?" Johnny thought about this. "Maybe, but we'll have to bring them back to church." Sue thought for a moment. "Maybe we could decorate the box and give it to Miss Julie. That will give us an excuse to bring it back to church." Johnny frowned. "We should put a present in it. Then she could open the present." "We'd have to tell her to open it from underneath." "Yes." Sue brightened. "I have a present I can give her. I have the glass star." "Okay. But I get to give it to her, because it's my star." Johnny scowled. He wanted to give the box to Miss Julie. "But they're my Drinkles," he almost said. But then he knew that really, they weren't his Drinkles. So he growled, "Okay." Christmas Eve came, bright with candles. Johnny carried his box with him into their pew. He let Sue hold her hand on it because she had helped decorate it. "It's for Miss Julie," they told Mommy and Daddy. They had drawn a star, a cross, an angel, and a Santa on it, and had slipped the little glass star in with the Drinkles. As soon as they arrived, Sue gave the box to Miss Julie. "You have to open it from underneath," she insisted. "Open it from underneath." Miss Julie said, "All right," and pulled the bottom flaps of the box open. Mr. Mark stood next to her, peering over her shoulder. The star dropped into Miss Julie's hand. "Oh, look, Mark, it's an ornament." She showed Mr. Mark. Then she turned back to Sue. "Thank you. This is very sweet." Beneath the star and around her hands, and somehow beyond her sight, the Drinkles poured out of their box, leaping like reindeer down to the pew below. They spread like a flood through all the pews of the whole church, and everyone's eyes brightened. The organist started playing. They sang Christmas carols and heard about the baby Jesus. They lit candles and held them in the glow of silent night. Johnny and Sue sat together this time. They had asked to. "All right, you can sit together, but don't you dare fuss," Daddy had said. They didn't. Instead, they watched Miss Julie and Mr. Mark hold hands in front of them and lean against each other. They saw the edges of Mr. Steinham's mouth move upward because he could see that his daughter was happy. They saw Mr. Mansford's frown ease and Mommy sigh. And every once in a while, they saw a spindly, gray-green hand reach out from beneath the pew and draw in a single word from the people and the songs and the candles and the stars and the air itself. Joy.